Hey everyone. All right, welcome to our first live stream review of the 2023 exam season. Let me see. Welcome in. My name is Emily Glinkler. I see that a lot of you have been forced to be here by your teachers, and I'm sorry, but I don't know. Also not sorry. Like, I'm going to help you whether you like it or not. So anyway, welcome in. Today we're going to be talking about units 1 and 2. So if this is the first thing that you're doing to review, you're in the right place. Don't you worry. If you have not started reviewing at all, it's okay. Now is the exact right time to start reviewing for the AP exam. If you've already been reviewing, good for you. Don't brag about it too much, right? But just know that you're ahead of the game. If you haven't started anything yet, it's totally fine. So what I wanted to do today was mostly focus on the first 2 units, but I also wanted to use these first 2 units, which frankly are kind of some of the least important units for the AP exam. I wanted to use this as a way to show you how I would review the rest of the content for the course. And so I'm going to talk a little bit too about just what the exam is going to look like and how you should be preparing, because it might be different from how you've prepared for other history tests. So with that, the whole point of being here live on YouTube is the chat, is so that you can get your questions answered in the chat. So if you have something specific to either what the exam is going to look like or these first 2 units, please share them in the chat and I will do my best to answer as many as I possibly can. I obviously won't be able to get to everything, so make sure you're subscribed to my YouTube channel. I have tons of other YouTube videos on how to write essays, specific rubric points on the essays, multiple choice strategies, more deep dives into content, all that good stuff. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's talk about the AP exam. So this is a super overwhelming graphic that hopefully will make sense in a second, which is just kind of showing you what the exam is going to look like in just one visual. So essentially the way you should read this is meant to help you understand where you should be focusing your time as you study. And I have it divided up by the different parts of the exam. So if you're not familiar already, obviously you're gonna have a multiple choice, and then you're gonna have a bunch of different writing types. You're gonna have a short answer, LEQ, DBQ. I'll do other videos on those. I'll do some live on, maybe live, we can go through a DBQ together or something. That will be later, right? What I want us to focus on right now are the eras. Your brain is probably feeling overwhelmed with how much content there is in AP World, and your brain is not wrong. There's a ton of content. But ultimately, when you simplify it down, we're just talking about 4 eras. That's it. The College Board divides them into 9 units, and your teachers probably divided them up even more by region or whatever, but we're really just talking about 4 eras. And so looking at those 4 eras, which ones are the most important to know the most about, and which ones are the least important? The simple answer is, if you're going to focus on any eras as you study between now and May, it should be from 1450 to 1900. That's basically units 3, 4, 5, and 6. I can explain in more detail about this whole chart and why, but I hope you'll just trust me and know that this is where the majority of the questions for the exam are going to come from. You can be pretty confident you'll have at least one LEQ prompt from one of these 2 eras. It's likely your DBQ could be from one of these eras. You'll most likely have an SAQ from one of these eras. Units 7 and 8 are also important, but they're more familiar to us. It's like the 20th century, World Wars, Cold War. So students just have a little bit easier time with those units. They're also more fresh in our brains. So the reason I'm telling you this right now is that I want us to understand that units 1 and 2 are important, but you don't need to go into the same level of depth in these units as you will for future units. Meaning when you're going back and reviewing, I wouldn't make flashcards for units 1 and 2, and I wouldn't try to memorize specific terms and try to memorize specific names of rulers and dates and whatever for units 1 and 2. You don't really need that level of depth. I'm going to talk to you about kind of the level of depth you need today. Because we know we're going to see units 1 and 2 on the multiple choice. We'll probably have one SAQ from this era, and one of our LEQs might be from this era, but they've already told us there's no DBQ on this era. The DBQ will be from 1450 or later. So there's not going to be a DBQ on the Mongols. There's not going to be a DBQ on the Song Dynasty, anything like that. They've already told us that. So what that means is that you can save yourself a little bit of time and stress. You can watch this YouTube, you can maybe do a little bit of light reviewing as you lead up to the May exam, but you can focus more of your time and energy on the later units and you'll be perfectly fine on the AP exam. Okay, so I'm gonna start right now, Mason. Okay, let's see. So here's the review strategy, and I'm gonna show you how to do this with units 1 and 2. For the whole test, though, the most important thing to know for this exam is the big ideas and the major developments. Specific facts, specific names, dates, events are the least important part of your studying process. I promise you. This exam is way more about, do you understand the big major developments that are going on? Do you understand big broad themes that are happening? And then can you point to a few examples, normally of your own choosing, to support that big development? So it's not as important that you can like list out every single Chinese ruler during the Song dynasty. In fact, I can't name a single one. I bet one of their last name was Song. But anyway, it's more important than you could tell me some major developments that are going on in the Song dynasty and or even in Asia. And then you can point to a few specific things the Song dynasty were doing to prove that point. So let me show you what I mean with Unit 1. So this is straight from the College Board's mouth. This is what the College Board is telling you that they want you to be able to do. This is the main focus for Unit 1 is comparison. Dates do not matter in Unit 1. There's really no chronology in Unit 1 except for like before the Mongols or after the Mongols. That's it, right? And so what they really want you to be able to talk about in Unit 1 is just comparing state building methods across different regions. That's it. Tell me how different states gained and maintained power during this time period and be able to say like, hey, these two things are kind of similar, or hey, this region's doing something different than the other ones over here. That's the most important thing. If you're familiar with like spice tea themes, society, politics, culture, blah, 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 that's a really useful tool for this unit because, again, you don't need to be able to list out every civilization. You don't need to be able to list out specific events. You need to be able to do big, broad comparisons. So I'm going to show you a map that I've made. You'll see this on a few of the slides. Some of these images are from a review packet that I make and I sell on my website for $10. So if you like some of these images, they're part of a massive review packet that I have, but I'm going to use some of them to review in these YouTube lives as well. So this is a map essentially of all the powerful states that if I were you, I would know from Unit 1. And what I think we can go about this in a few different ways. One of the ways that I like to think about Unit 1, and again, please use the chat if you're looking at this map and you're like, oh, I don't remember anything about one of these civilizations, or you've never heard of one, or there's something you want me to go over in more detail, please tell me in the chat and I'll do that. But for now, I just want to highlight that essentially Unit 1 is really weird. Most AP World History teachers don't like Unit 1, and it's because Unit 1 starts just like in the middle of a time period. 1200 is a totally random year. I mean, I can tell you a few reasons why they picked that year, but like it's totally random. It's right in the middle of an era. It would be like starting an era in like 1965. You're like, what? Well, we're in the middle of a bunch of stuff, right? And so Unit 1 is essentially a roll call. It's like we've time traveled to the year 1200. And we're just looking around going, who's here? And we basically hop from region to region. We're like, what's going on in East Asia? What's going on in South Asia? So on and so forth. So you don't need to know every single civilization, but I would know at least one or two civilizations from each of the main regions. And yes, I'm going to talk about the Abbasid Caliphate in depth for sure. So with that in mind, there's a few different ways you can organize your thoughts here. You can do it region by region. You can be like, okay, in East Asia, let's talk about the one main civilization like the Song. Or in the Middle East, Islamic world, let's talk about one civilization, the Abbasid. Another way to think of it too is big land-based empires versus smaller trading states. And the reason why I like this is because you might remember that that's also how the College Board organizes things in Unit 3 and 4. They're going to talk in Unit 3 about like, oh, more big land-based empires. And then Unit 4 is going to be about like bigger, but maritime trading states. So if you can kind of get that in your brain now, it's a lot easier to have, you basically have continuity as you're studying, which makes it easier for your brain. So let's use green for land-based. So let's talk about, there are some of these like big traditional, basically each region has at least one big traditional land-based empire. And yes, this live is going to be saved. This recording will be saved and on my YouTube for the rest of AP season. So if we go kind of east from west, we have like the Song dynasty in East Asia is a traditional big kind of land-based empire, right? There's a lot of farming. They kind of are self-sufficient. If they trade, it's for luxury goods, that type of thing. The Khmer is going to be similar, and Southeast Asia is a bigger traditional, if you're familiar with like the Roman Empire, right? If you're familiar with some of these older classical empires, these are doing similar things. In India or South Asia, we'll talk about kind of the Delhi Sultanate is like the big main powerful empire there, although there are others. In Dar al-Islam or the Middle East, you have the Abbasid Caliphate. In West Africa, you have Mali. Keep in mind, like other civilizations exist, right? But these are just sort of the main big ones. And so with that, this live is going to be an hour, by the way, ish. I'll go over if we need to, or I'll stop if we don't need to go that long. So one thing I would think about is what do a lot of these bigger land-based empires have in common? Because it's going to make it a lot easier to study them. So if you look at like the Song dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate, which is basically it was the most united Islamic empire. It's going to slowly break apart, but it's the empire that had like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. It moves Baghdad to be its capital. It's sort of emblematic of this like golden age of the Islamic world in the Abbasid Caliphate, where they're sending out merchants. They open up Islam to everyone. They make it a universal religion, whereas before it had been kind of exclusively for ethnic Arab people before this time period. So the Abbasid Caliphate is essentially like the golden age of Islamic empires during this era. And the Song and the Abbasid are both doing things very similarly. They're both large. They're powerful because they control trade routes. They're on either end of trade routes. They also have a lot of land that can then supply their really powerful capital cities, and they're actively sponsoring innovation, right? And so we think about kind of these big land-based states. These are all on kind of one end of some of these big trade routes, right? So one of the themes of the next few eras is like everyone's wanting to get to these most powerful trading states. So one end of basically all three of the main trade routes ends in Song China. They all kind of go through the Abbasid Caliphate or just the Islamic world. A lot of them end up in Delhi in India. The tail end of the Saharan trade, it goes right through Mali, right? And so that's one of the reasons why they're able to grow big. They also tend to use religion as a uniting force, right? So they're using like, and I'll talk more about this later, but they're using like Confucianism or Islam in Mali, right? They're adopting Islam to kind of unite this bigger growing empire and try to expand out their influence among trade. That's one type of civilization during this era. Another type, though, is we have these smaller trading states that are not producing many things of their own, but they are geographically well situated to basically take advantage of these trade routes. So this would be like the Swahili coast city-states. This would be the confusing to a lot of students Southeast Asian states. So we'll talk about those as well, right? And yeah, so these are all the states that are present and we'll see on a later map, if we're talking about like the Silk Road going across, we're talking about the Indian Ocean trade, the Saharan Desert. These are the civilizations-ish, some of them fall with the Mongols, but that are around when Marco Polo is traveling or Ibn Battuta is traveling around, right? It's all during this time period. So something unique is happening, you'll notice, on the edges of these trade routes, which is that you can be smaller states. For example, on the Swahili coast, some of these are just city-states. Even in like the Majapahit, let me pick a different color. Even in like the Majapahit, they really only control directly this one half of this one island, but they can grow really powerful because they're situated perfectly, right? So if you want to get from the Middle East and you want to get down and get a lot of the wealth of Central and Southern Africa that's mined out of, let's say, Great Zimbabwe, you got to go through the Swahili coast. If you want to go out and you want to go around India and get over to China, you have to kind of go through these civilizations. So again, to simplify it in your brain, there are kind of two different types of states. They're either like the big guys, the big trading states that are the destination for traders. They are growing things, they're making things, they're weaving things, they're innovating things, whatever. Or They're the smaller trading states that are capitalizing off of all the traffic coming through. So a really good example, and keep in mind, you don't have to know very much about some of these states. So let's take the Majapahit, for example. And I'll tell you right now, I honestly think you only need to know one or the other. So Srivijaya or Majapahit, they're very similar. What's more important is that, again, you can point to some of these civilizations as evidence of like a different type of state. So if you're doing an essay or an SAQ and they're asking you about, big land-based trading states, and they want to ask about something different, or you want to be able to show an exception, you can then point to, let's say, the Majapahit, or let's say Kilwa on the Swahili coast, again, as an example of a state that's doing something different. You don't need to know a ton of stuff about the Majapahit. Let me tell you everything I know about the Majapahit. And if I don't know it, then you don't need to know it, right? They're right here. They're on the coast of, I believe this is the island of Java. They build a tributary empire. A lot of these islands, they have these little tributary tribes, civilization states that pay, again, tribute to them. It's like a mini version of what China's doing or what the Aztecs are doing at the same time. And they gain most of their wealth and power off taxing ships that are coming through and passing by their islands to try to get to China. So the Majapahit themselves, they produce some things. And of course, later they're going to produce like spices, and that's why Europeans are going to want to go there. But for now, they're mostly benefiting just off of trade exclusively. They're not growing a ton of stuff. They're not making a ton of stuff. The Majapahit, for example, actually ally with a group, they're called sea nomads. They're literally nomadic people that live on boats. They're different from pirates around this part of the Indian Ocean. So they develop this alliance with this nomadic group. And they basically say, hey, as ships are coming through with their big lateen sails and they're going across the Indian Ocean, we want you to funnel and kind of force those ships to go, like, let's say through here or through here, so that we can tax them and then we'll give you a cut, right? That's an example. That's literally all I know about the Majapahit, by the way. That's it. That's all that I know. I couldn't name a single ruler for you. I couldn't tell you the exact years when they existed, but I know that they were a trading state that built these tributary island states, and they benefited off of trade going from the Indian Ocean over into China, right? And so again, don't panic. You're not going to be asked a question on the exam. You're not going to be asked an SAQ that's going to be like, tell me about Srivijaya. Just never, right? You're not going to get that question. You might get, let's say, a document that talks about Srivijaya and gives you some information. And then it's like, give me one other example of a state that was doing something similar to them. And you can be like, one other example was the Majapahit or whatever, right? So again, for a lot of these civilizations, you don't need to know a ton of detail about them individually, but you need to know how they prove or discuss something bigger that's going on in world history, right? Yeah, so again, these like bigger states that produce goods are going to be China, right? They're going to be the Delhi Sultanate. So China producing porcelain and silk, right? That sort of thing. The Mali producing gold, salt, enslaved people, unfortunately, right? These are kind of the big guys that they're producing a lot of the goods that are being traded. And then there's smaller states like the Swahili coast, Vijayanagara even, in Southeast Asia that are benefiting more off of just trading those goods. So this is also one of the, this is the era where nomadic people have the most influence in world history. The most influence is during this era. Think about the Mongols as the best example. But think about, there's a lot of people that have to connect these two civilizations together or these civilizations together, right? And a lot of times those are going to be nomadic or semi-nomadic people. Those sea nomads, for example, or just people like merchants that are constantly on the move. And so again, it's not going to be till later eras that we're going to have these big like empires where like the sea itself is controlled by Britain, for example. We're not there yet. Okay. So again, with that in mind, if you only have room in your brain for two civilizations, it needs to be the Song dynasty and Dar al-Islam, whatever you want to call it. Those are the two that would be the two I would know the most about, right? Is Song China and the Abbasid Caliphate, because those are the two most powerful states. And the Abbasid Caliphate fractures and falls apart, but it stays united as like the Islamic world, So we can oversimplify. We just call it kind of Dar al-Islam, the house or the world of Islam. Those are the two most influential states of this time period by far. And it's no coincidence that those are also the two ends of what's going to become the Mongol Empire. Basically, if the Mongols want to conquer it, you know it's really important. That's why they didn't care that much about Western Europe. They're like, whatever, who cares about France, right? Okay. One thing to note is, like, don't forget about the Americas, but also you don't need to know as much about the Americas. I would just be able to point to, let's say, the Aztec and the Inca and some things that they're doing that are similar to what other states are doing back in Asia and Africa, or if they're doing anything unique. So we're going to talk about that in the next few slides, and I'll kind of bring them in a little bit. Okay. Okay, so these are like the three questions that you kind of want to be able to answer for Unit 1. And yes, like I'll go back to that slide for just a second. The Mongols are the ones that finally end the Song dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate, all these different empires. They sort of wipe the slate clean. Okay. One thing I want to say, actually, I'm going to go back here for a second, is do you need to know dates? And the answer is no, except for you need to know eras. So a lot of you are asking really good questions in the chat where you're like, is this the same time as this thing? Is this when this is also happening? And those are the right questions to be asking, because you do not need to know any dates on the AP exam. Like, you're never going to be asked, when was the Magna Carta signed? When was the House of Wisdom founded? I don't know. Well, I know some of them, but you're not going to be asked that. What you need to know are these 4 years. You need to know the years of the eras: 1200 to 1450 to 1750 to 1900. So the only stuff that I think you really need to memorize for this exam is these 4 eras. You need to get good enough in your brain where if you're reviewing and you go, okay, you see the years 1200 to 1450, your brain can kind of go, okay, we're talking about Song China, Dar al-Islam, Mongols, medieval Europe. Like, you need to be able to jog your own memory and kind of remind yourself what eras, like Silk Road, right? You need to have maybe 4 or 5 things that you can just memorize, almost like a formula in a math or science test, so that even on the exam, as soon as they say, open your booklet and start, like you do in a math test and you write down all the formulas really fast, right? You could literally do that. You could literally just write the 4 eras and then really quickly jot down like Song, Dar al-Islam, Mongols, medieval Europe, Silk Road, just so that as you're bouncing around the test and they're giving you different years, you can again situate your brain and go, okay, this is this era. Within those eras, there are times when like you might pick 1 or 2 dates to just kind of memorize to help you be able to like mark where you are in the era. But those are really the only 4 years you need to know, because on the essays, for example, they're going to ask you, like, an LEQ might be evaluate similar methods of state building in Asia from 1200 to 1450. And what that means is you can talk about any civilization in Asia during this time period. You can talk about any of these and compare what they're doing. It would be a really generous prompt, but you have to know what they're talking about. You have to know when they say 1200 to 1450 what they mean. So again, in terms of dates, that's like the most important thing to do. Okay. All right. So the most common themes of Unit 1 among these states is using belief systems to gain legitimacy. And they do this in one of 2 ways. Religion is the single most important element or factor in any of these states right now. It's religion and trade. Like, those are the 2 things that you want to focus on in this whole time period. How are states using religion to gain and maintain power? And how are states capitalizing on trade to gain more power? Okay, so with that in mind, you can kind of use religion to gain legitimacy in kind of one of two ways. You can either use it to dominate another religion, dominate other people, or you can use it to try to unite people together. And so you might want to know a few examples of each. I think a pretty obvious example of using religion to kind of dominate would be the Aztec practice of human sacrifice, right? So the Aztec Empire in Mesoamerica was another tributary state. This is something you see across a lot of civilizations. They're not quite powerful enough yet to directly control these bigger empires, that's going to come with gunpowder, right? But they are powerful enough to at least be able to say like, well, we're the most powerful state in Mesoamerica and you all owe us tribute. Think like the capital and the districts in Hunger Games. Our volunteers tribute. That's happening in like China. That's happening with the Majapahit and the Srivijaya. That's happening with the Aztecs. It's happening kind of all over. It's kind of similar in medieval Europe to like feudalism. For example, the king maybe can't directly control all of his subjects, but he can have this feudal system where he kind of can. That's happening everywhere. Gunpowder comes along in the next era thanks to the Mongols. And now they're like, oh, now we have a way to like really force our dominance. So religion is a really useful way to force your dominance. The Aztecs, they demanded tribute of a lot of things, crops, gems, goods, and also people for sacrifice. This is partly, it's because they believed that's what they needed to like satisfy their gods. It's not just a political tool, but it's also a political tool. And yes, like the Inca, for example, also practiced human sacrifice on a smaller scale. And again, the idea was it's a way to actually practice your religion, but it's also a way to assert your power over other civilizations. So for example, when the Spanish come through in Mesoamerica, Hernan Cortez, and he's like, we want to go take down the Aztecs. There's lots of other indigenous people who are like very happy to do that because they've been below the Aztec civilization. It's like, right, coming through District 12, if you're District 13 and saying, hey, we want to overthrow the capital, they're like, yes, please. I'm obsessed with the Hunger Games. That's neither here nor there. Another example of a state that is going to use religion to dominate another place is going to be the Delhi Sultanate in India. So the Delhi Sultanate in India is the first time that you have Muslims coming in and ruling the Hindu majority. And as we know, that's going to kind of happen. That's going to be a continuity throughout the rest of Indian history, really up until like India and Pakistan separate, right? And so this building is just an example of this, right? This is called the Qutub Minar. You don't need to know this necessarily, but it could be a cool extra piece of evidence. It's in Delhi. And when the Muslims came in and conquered at least North India, they actually tore down, there was a Hindu temple, and then they built this mosque and minaret out of the stones and the bricks from the Hindu temple. So it's a very literal example of a state coming in and being like, we're going to take what is yours and we're going to turn it around and use it to kind of honor our God. And now keep in mind, Muslims in India are never going to have success converting everyone to Islam because the people in India already have Hinduism and it's been there for thousands of years, but they are successful at putting themselves basically on the top of that sort of Hindu caste system and ruling kind of through force a lot of the time. Okay, the other way states are using religion, though, is for unity, right? So this doesn't mean that these first states I talked about are mean and the other states are nice. It's just a different strategy. So for example, China is a really good example kind of throughout the dynasty system. China is a really good example of using Confucianism to maintain unity in China, right? And so during this time period, the Song don't invent Confucianism. That was around long before. But what they do is they reinforce it. And so they have their entire government built on Confucian ethics. So everyone in the government has studied Confucian texts. They've passed really rigorous exams to like make their way into the government. They're all literally on the same page about what makes a good ruler, what makes a good person, all according to Confucian ethics. That provides a lot of unity. It's not always nice. Confucian ethics are really hierarchical. It sucks to be a woman in especially this era of like a Confucian civilization, right? There's a ton of rules and hierarchy, but it provides stability for China. And even when during the Song dynasty, when Buddhism is starting to become more popular, Buddhists spread out along these trade routes and start to become really popular in China, the Song dynasty recognized that they're like, okay, we could either like force out the Buddhists, right? We could do what medieval Europe is going to do, Christians forcing out Jews, for example. We could force them out. We could try to use force. We could try to dominate our other belief systems, or we could try to incorporate them to unify. And that's what they do with Neo-Confucianism, right? So Neo-Confucianism is them saying, you know what, let's take some of the more popular elements of Buddhism and combine them with like an updated form of Confucianism and let people know like, look, you can practice both, but you have to practice Confucianism because that's the foundation of our government, right? In medieval Europe is a weird mix. Medieval Europe is always the weird one in this era because they're just like off doing their own thing. God knows what they're doing in medieval Europe, right? They're really fragmented. Western Europe does not have one dominant state like the other regions do. East Asia has China, right? South Asia has the Delhi Sultanate, so on. West Africa has Mali. Western Europe doesn't have one single dominating force, except they have the church, right? So they have the church out of the Vatican, but that's separate from these different feudal kingdoms in what's going to become England and France and the Holy Roman Empire, right? And so it's interesting because medieval Europe is using religion to unite its people. Christianity is like the only thing uniting Western Europe, right? But they're also then using that unity to force out anyone who's not a Christian. So one thing that's happening during this era, this is the era of the Crusades, right? This is the era when Western European Christians are constantly going into the Holy Land, the Middle East, to try to reconquer it from the Muslims. They ultimately are not successful. This is also a period where Jewish people across Europe are being forced out, and they're often invited into the Islamic world. So again, the Islamic world is really the center of the world during this era, and it's the most important civilization of this era. They're at the center of all the trade routes. They, by many accounts, are the most tolerant of all the different civilizations. They're going to be the ones, the Muslims, actively promoting trade the most, whereas a lot of other civilizations like China even look down on merchants. They don't see them as very valuable. They're like, oh, you're sort of a necessary evil. In Islam, Muhammad himself was a merchant, like they really highly value. And so that's one of the reasons why Islam is going to spread so quickly, is because they really encourage trade and innovation. They really encourage diversity within their empire. And yes, the Iberian Peninsula was under Dar al-Islam. So let's go back to this map for a second. So Dar al-Islam, which again, the major civilization at this time before the Mongols come in is the Abbasid Caliphate, but like, you know, there's other civilizations too. Again, the Islamic world is crushing it during this era. I mean, this is literally the center of the world, and it's also sort of figuratively the center of the world. And yeah, they control all the way up into Spain. So it's called Al-Andalus. And this would be like later on when Shakespeare is talking about Moors in Spain. This is what he's talking about, Muslims in Spain, right? So this era is going to end right when Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain are attempting their Reconquista, right? So by the end of this era, there's some conflict in Spain, but it's still controlled by the Muslims. And so again, one of the major developments of this era is the rise and spread of Islam that's been rising since the year 600. And really, Islam is the most mobile and the most impactful of all the religions of this era, because they're sending out traders and merchants and sometimes conquering forces like into India to come and like basically influence any of the most powerful trading states. So they have a foothold in Europe. In West Africa, they form these alliances with the kings of Mali, who convert to Islam, partly because they believe in it, but also because you get a lot of trading advantages if you're part of Dar al-Islam. You have the same thing with on the east coast of Africa, let's say. Let me make sure. Okay. So again, the rise and spread of Islam is like maybe the single most important development that's happening during this era. Okay, I'm scrolling through the chat too. I'm trying to keep track of if I can answer as many questions. Okay. Yeah, so there's a good conversation happening too about two things. About the Reformation, that's next unit. So this unit is really kind of like setting the stage. And then the next unit is when a lot of things start to change. So this unit is like, okay, how are states traditionally gaining and maintaining power? They're controlling trade routes, they have a unifying religion, whatever. The next era is when everything gets blown up. We have the Age of Exploration and the Reformation and Sunni Shia wars, and things kind of start to go into chaos, right? So this unit is a lot more calm. There's not necessarily a specific event that you need to know from this era, except probably the Mongol conquest, right? Okay, so religion is really important in this era as as a unifying force. That's either for a smaller group like the Muslims in India to dominate the Hindu majority, or it's to like unite everyone like in China. The other thing that's happening that a lot of the most powerful states are doing is they're actively promoting innovation and exchange. And this is not always the case, right? There are a lot of civilizations that we learn about that are actually really fearful of change. They're really fearful of new ideas. Medieval Europe, for example, is really the Catholic Church is really fearful of new ideas in this era. They're the exception. Again, they're the weirdos. They're actively discouraging any sort of knowledge that might contradict what the church is saying, right? So if scientists are going like, I kind of think that the earth revolves around the sun, they're like, no, it doesn't, because the earth is the kingdom of heaven, and like heaven has to be the center of the universe, right? So they're the weird ones. The vast majority of civilizations that are powerful during this era, the most powerful ones are the ones that are actively promoting diversity, new ideas, and exchange. And again, the best examples of that are Song China and the Islamic world. Just over and over again, right? If you only know two civilizations, those are the two. So these are some examples of what I mean. Like this is from a bigger a piece of artwork. It's massive. It's like dozens of feet long and really tall. Of, I believe, Hangzhou, China, which is like a port city from this time period. And it's incredibly populated thanks to Champa rice, among other things, right? You can see it's really crowded. It's like a bustling marketplace. There's boats coming in, there's markets, there's vendors. China did a few things to actively promote innovation. And keep in mind, right, all of the most important inventions are coming out mostly of China in this era. You have gunpowder, the compass, paper, printing, a lot of the inventions that we know are going to be so important in the next era and on are being invented in China. Well, why? Why are they so much more innovative, right? Well, one reason is because they made it a priority. The Song actually actively like decreased their military spending and shrunk down into the south of China. And they're like, but we're going to focus instead on innovation and science and new ideas. So for example, in Hangzhou, they extended curfews. They made it easier to stay out later. They allowed different quarters, like the Arab quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Chinese quarter, whatever, to mix and mingle more. They expanded their university system. So they let more people, all men, but still, they let more people come to their universities and learn. You actively promoted poetry during this time. You have all these scientists and inventors. There's one named Su Song, who Leonardo da Vinci is like the European Su Song, right? Su Song is doing a lot of the stuff Da Vinci is going to do later on, right? And it's because the government is saying like, let's invest in education, partly because it gives them power, right? If you're being educated in a Confucian system and the government is built on a Confucian system, then education and knowledge doesn't threaten that system, it strengthens it, right? Whereas in, let's say, Western Europe, education is going to contradict what the church is saying often. And so education and innovation and new ideas actually threatens the Pope and the church that's in power, right? So that's why they don't promote innovation, whereas let's say China does. Same in Islam. This is a picture from the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. So the early sultans of the Abbasid Caliphate were like straight up nerds, right? I mean, literally like one of the early sultans, I think his name is Mahmud, he like was an Egyptologist and went and helped excavate the pyramids of Giza, like as Sultan of the Abbasid Caliphate. They founded the House of Wisdom and they were like, let's invite some of the best scholars from around the known world to come and study here. So they invite scholars from India, from West Africa, from around the Middle East to come. They're actively translating texts. So this is part of what's called the translation movement. So you have, for example, the first text that was translated by the House of Wisdom was a work by Aristotle. The House of Wisdom is also really helped along by Jews that are coming in. So Jews that are being forced out of Europe come in a lot of times because Jews couldn't own land. They became involved in finance or scholarship, like they went to universities and studied. And so they become really important to these Muslim empires as a source of trade connections and also knowledge. So a lot of the reason why Europe is going to be able to have this renaissance and, quote, rediscover Greek and Roman texts is because of the Muslims and the Jews who are like preserving it and translating it during this era. They're also inventing algebra. They're helping with navigational technology to help them trade. Astronomy is really important in Islam because if you're traveling out in the middle of the desert, you need to know which way is Mecca. You need to be able to read the stars when you're on the Indian Ocean to know where you're going and also where you need to pray to 5 times a day, right? Same thing too. This is the kind of, I think this is a Marco Polo traveling to China during the Mongol peace. Someone was asking like, why did the Mongols want to conquer what they did? And we'll talk about that in a second. But the short answer is power and control of trade. They came to control basically the entire Silk Road. The Inca and the Aztecs are also incredibly innovative, right? You have terrace farming, you have these incredible bridges throughout the Andes. The point is that really like the outlier here is Western Europe, right? That is sort of still in this like manorial system. Most people aren't reading or writing. Most people don't ever really leave their manor. And the people in power, most notably the church, are kind of actively discouraging innovation and new ideas, which is one of the reasons why they're sort of cut off from the rest of the world via trade. It's also one of the reasons, spoiler, why the Black Death is going to hurt them so badly, because they've been sort of isolated. And so when all of a sudden they open themselves back up and the Mongols kind of spread that disease, it has such a bad impact on them, partly because they've been so isolated. Ironically, what the exact thing they're going to then do to the American civilizations. Okay. I'm going to talk about the Pax Mongolica. Don't you worry. All right. The other big question here before we get to very quickly Unit 2, because it's the same stuff, is how are states benefiting from trade? And this is pretty obvious. They're getting lots of stuff and they're getting wealth and power, right? And so this is Mansa Musa. There's only a few people that really you should probably know during this era, and Mansa Musa is one of them. We all know this. He's like the richest man in world history, right? He controlled Mali. He actively sponsored new universities at Timbuktu. He went on his Hajj to Mecca and spread gold around and like collapsed the Egyptian economy. He's just a really great example of a leader during this time period who recognized the value of trade, that recognized that like, if I can become part of this Islamic world, this Dar al-Islam, right? If I can travel across North Africa, meet with a bunch of other nomadic Muslims and sedentary Muslims across North Africa, go to Mecca, meet with actual Arab Muslims and cement these relationships, my empire of Mali is going to be more powerful because they have other empires too. The Songhai are rising up and trying to challenge them, that sort of thing. Timbuktu becomes a city, like a really important center of learning in West Africa, where scholars come from around the world to try to visit there. I think we know how trade states benefit from trade, so I'm going to kind of move on from this one. All right. Unit 2 is the same thing. Unit 2 is the same civilizations, but the focus, instead of being on state building, right? So like Unit 1, the big question is, how are states gaining and maintaining power? And I just answered that for you. Religion, innovation, trade. That's it. Well, then Unit 2 is like, okay, let's look just more broadly. Let's zoom out and just look at what is going on with these trade routes and what's happening like across multiple states because of this trade, right? And so with that in mind, I tried to kind of draw out for you some of the major trade routes and some of the major trading cities. You do not need to know all of these cities. I would know a few. I would be able to pull out, like for a short answer question, like 1 or 2 trading cities kind of in each region that you could talk about as like, oh, these are some powerful cities that rose because they were important like parts of the trade routes. But in general, what the AP exam is going to want you to understand is the consequences of this trade. So let's talk about the Mongols for a second, right? The Mongols rise up thanks to Genghis Khan, and they come to control, I mean, just like an insane amount of the world, right? The AP exam is not going to ask you probably about like the military tactics of the Mongols. They're probably not going to ask you about Genghis Khan's origin story, even though it's really badass or whatever. What they're going to ask you about is like, why did the Mongols conquer where they did, which is a good question one of you had in the chat, and what was the impact of it? So the short answer is they understood. The Mongols basically learned all the stuff we just talked about from Unit 1. They basically took everything that we learned about from Unit 1 and they put it all together into the largest all-connected empire in human history. And so Genghis Khan recognized that like for his people to have power, they couldn't be these just nomadic people in North Central Asia. They had to get down further south and control these Silk Road routes. And so Genghis Khan, using all those military strategies, basically unites the entire Silk Road. That's this Pax Mongolica. And so why we are so fascinated by the Pax Mongolica, it's the single most important thing that's happening during this era. We're talking, this is right around like 1300, smack dab in the middle of it, is because the Pax Mongolica unites almost an entire trade route, the Silk Road, into one state and is able to promote the spread of knowledge and goods and people so much faster than any other state on their own. Because think about it, right? If you're going from the Song and then there's nomadic groups hopping, and then eventually you get to the Islamic world, that's a lot of hoops to jump through. You're going to have to make a lot of it's not going to be as safe. But if it's all underneath the power of the Mongols, well, as historians now, we can really look and see, okay, what was the impact of this? Because a ton of trade is all of a sudden happening, right? There are other reasons why they want to conquer, right? I mean, they wanted to conquer China because China saw themselves as superior to the nomadic Mongols. Genghis Khan wanted to avenge his father's death, lots of other reasons. But ultimately, why they conquered where they did is because they understood the power of these trade routes. So this Pax Mongolica is around 100 years beyond Genghis Khan's life, where essentially the entire Silk Road was under one state, the Mongols. And it was incredibly safe, right? I mean, traders and travelers write about how they could basically walk essentially the length of the Silk Road and not have any protection because the Mongol laws were so strict and so well carried out that they knew they would be safe. And so I want us to think about this narrative. Before the Mongols come in, let's just look at the Song. You have the Song dynasty innovating. They have this incredibly diverse and cosmopolitan culture. They're innovating things let's take gunpowder. But gunpowder technology is not spreading very far beyond China. It's not until the Mongols come along and they go and they take gunpowder from China and are y'all are using this mostly for fireworks and small little fire lances. We think we could do more with it. And they start to combine innovations. So they then talk to scholars in Baghdad. They bring in some iron specialists from Western Europe. They bring in scholars from everywhere. And they're why don't you make me something new? And they invent the cannon, right? The cannon is invented under Genghis Khan. And so the idea here is that, okay, you had all these different states that were benefiting from trade. They were using that wealth to innovate and come up with new ideas. But it's not really till the Mongols come and unite them all together that they can really facilitate the spread of these ideas. It's why, spoiler, in the next era, even when the Mongols fall, everywhere where the Mongols were, Russia, China, Middle East, are going to become these gunpowder empires. That's why those gunpowder empires rise where they do, is because they're rising out of the ashes of the Pax Mongolica, right? Okay. So, of course, it's not just gunpowder that spreads, it's goods, it's crops, it's disease. So let's talk about that a little bit as well. I love this question too. I see a hypothetical question on were there states that could exist without trade? And it's a really important question because yes, one thing I want us to understand is when we're looking at a map like this, or a map with the earlier civilizations, is that all the areas that are white are not empty. There are tons of civilizations and tribes and small states and people that are living there that are just doing perfectly fine. And keep in mind that a lot of these states, they're not trading for necessary goods. Now in the 21st century, if we all of a sudden just cut off trade outside of the United States, there would be some necessary goods that we just now don't have access to anymore. That's not what's happening here. The vast majority of trade during this era is luxury goods and innovations. So to that question, which is a really good one, I think most civilizations could have continued to exist and survive without any trade, but they wouldn't have had the same innovation. They wouldn't have had the same level of sophistication. They wouldn't have had all the same luxury goods, if that makes sense. But for the most part, you're growing what you need to eat where you are, right? Maybe you don't have the exact type of grain that you want, but you can survive. It's a very good question. All right. Here are the trade routes. Please, you do not need to memorize every single spice that was traded on the Indian Ocean. You don't. I don't know where cinnamon comes from. I can never remember. What you need to just understand is kind of what I was just talking about. The vast majority of the goods traded on these trade routes are luxury goods for the elites. They're not necessary items for the most part. They're not trading in a ton of grain that a state needs to feed their people. If they are trading something like that, it's maybe champa rice, which is a tributary payment to China from Vietnam, being hey, we've innovated and developed this new strain of rice that grows twice as fast, and we're giving it to you as a gift, not because you need it, but because we want to honor you as our tributary overlords. And so all of a sudden that allows them to like grow rice more quickly and feed more people and so on and so forth. But it wasn't like they needed it to survive, if that makes sense. Okay. We essentially have 3 trade routes. And I'm going to really oversimplify this here because they're every few years they'll give you an essay prompt that's kind of like compare the trade routes. And it's really nice. I think it's too nice, but you don't need to know that much detail. What I want you to think about, here are a few ways to oversimplify this. Okay. If the trade is happening on land, like the Silk Road and the Saharan trade, they are almost exclusively trading luxury goods or items that are so expensive that it makes the trouble worth it, right? What I always tell my students is a boat can carry more than a camel, which we all understand, right? And so if you're trading on a boat on the Indian Ocean and you have a big Chinese junk ship, well, yeah, you can throw some bulk goods in there too. You could throw some stonework. You can throw pounds and pounds and pounds of spices. You can throw Mongol horses on there, and it's fine. You'll also throw luxury goods as well. But if you're trading via a camel caravan and you're carrying it yourself or your camel is carrying it, you're only going to carry things that are worth it, like worth the bang for their bucks. You're talking gold, ivory, porcelain, silk, enslaved people to help you carry those things, right? So in general, if it's a land-based trade route, they're almost exclusively luxury goods. If it's an ocean-based trade route, it's luxury goods plus some other bulk stuff like spices and other grains and whatever. Again, you don't need to be able to list out all the spices. Okay, with that, I see a lot of people talking about money and paper money. Yes, we are starting to develop currency during this era, but not exactly the way we think of it today. So when we're thinking about innovations that helped expand these trade routes, one thing to be clear is that this category should be all together. Like paper money is helpful on other trade routes too. And the compass is helpful on all trade routes. But I kind of tried to focus on having a few for each trade route. So for example, camel saddle, where you can ride, you're not just having to walk alongside your camel, allows you to travel further. The caravan system for security, caravanserai, which are like basically highway motels in the middle of the desert where you know it's safe, you know that you can like sleep, you can rest, you can wait out a bad storm, whatever, and then keep going. In China, we have a few things that are happening, and one is going to be paper money, right? So paper money is invented in China kind of during this time period. But just to be clear, it's not like a universal currency. We're not talking about like the dollar bill. We're talking about just like a certificate from a Chinese government official that would be good to another Chinese government official. So you should think about it more almost like a check than a dollar bill, right? It's like you can't just go take that paper money anywhere in the world. You can really only take it to like your bank or your other place or whatever. But still, it all of a sudden allows people to travel lighter and travel further because they're not having to carry around their like gold coins. They can carry on paper money, at least when they're within certain areas. This is why, by the way, the Pax Mongolica is so important, because if you're all united under one government, trade becomes a lot more efficient. Because whatever the rules of trade are in China are going to be the same rules of trade over in Baghdad. And that's really valuable, right? It's why the EU is such a valuable trading bloc right now, is because all of a sudden, think about if you have a similar currency, you don't have as many barriers when you cross borders or whatever. That's basically what the Pax Mongolica was. We also have the development of banking houses and bills of exchange. And what's interesting about this actually is that these actually develop in Europe because of the Crusades. So this is like, if you're a Crusader, part of like the Knights Templar in London, and you want to help finance Crusaders, you basically want to like have a Kickstarter for people to go crusade in the Holy Land. You can basically like give money to the Knights Templar Bank and be like, I want this to then go to these people when they arrive in Jerusalem. They're going to go to this Knights Templar Bank in Jerusalem, and they're going to have this little piece of paper that's stamped with the Knights Templar that knows they're good for it. And then in Jerusalem, they'll give them the money and the things they need to go crusading. That was like what the early bills of exchange were, and early banking houses. In Europe, a lot of early banks were developed by Jews who were not allowed to own land themselves. And so instead, they were like, hey, if you're a farmer and you need some money to buy crops to invest for the next year, I'll give you some money, and then you kind of pay me back with some interest, because that's the only way they could really benefit from agriculture, is by loaning money to farmers, right? For example, Jews in Italy would sit in the town city center on benches to like for farmers when they were coming in for the market and be like, anyone need a loan? And those benches were bancas in Italian, which is where the word bank comes from. Fun fact. Okay. Same thing in the Indian Ocean. It's mostly about navigation. We're talking about lateen sails to harness the monsoon winds. We're talking about the compass, the astrolabe. Keep in mind, the compass is helpful if you're in the middle of the desert too, right? I mean, these are all helpful. So again, it's less important that you memorize all these things, and it's more important that you think about what the consequences of these trade routes are. And so this is what the College Board cares about. They call it consequences of connectivity, meaning like, okay, cool, the Silk Road, but why do we care about the Silk Road? Well, we care about how it's spreading innovation and culture, right? And so there's a few examples of this. Religion spreads around the trading world, right? And so where you have active trading states, you have a lot of diversity because states that value trade understand that diversity is good for that. If you are in China and you're in a Chinese port city, you want a Jewish community there. You want an Arab community there. You want a Majapahit community there, because they are then going to have connections back home where you're going to be able to get some of their stuff too, maybe for even a better deal, right? And so with that, this, for example, is a synagogue in Kaifeng, China, that was built in like the thousands or 1100s or something, right? So there's a thriving Jewish community in China, Arab community, that sort of thing. You also have the spread of innovations around the world. This is in one part of Western Europe, when we can see kind of things starting to change in Europe. We know what Europe's about to do in 1492, right? We know what's about to happen to European civilization. They're about to have this explosion of like a Renaissance, age of exploration, scientific revolution, literacy, all the sorts of things. And that would not happen without these trade routes through Africa and Asia. It just wouldn't happen. So this is, for example, showing someone doing math using like algebra or something, as opposed to like an abacus, right? So think about all of a sudden how different, if you were trying to do algebra with like Roman numerals, God help us all. But doing algebra with Arabic numerals, the numbers we use now, all of a sudden becomes a lot easier, right? And so you can start to have more discoveries and more innovations. The College Board is also really obsessed with, rightfully so, diasporic communities, meaning communities of people who have spread from their original like homeland. And so the two groups that we're going to see that the most are going to be Arab Muslims and Jews. Jews often are being spread by force. They're being like kicked out of places, especially in Christian Europe, but they're also being actively invited in other places because they can serve a really valuable role. Arab Muslims, again, the Islamic world is actively promoting, like Muhammad had a quote that basically said like, seek unto China, like seek knowledge even unto China, like go as far as you need to discover what there is out there, to learn, to trade, to interact. And yeah, partly to like spread the word of Islam, but Islam is not a proselytizing religion. It's not like Christianity or Buddhism where they're like, my main job is to go convert people. They really are like, no, we want you to go and explore and bring back these new ideas, this wealth, whatever, back to the Islamic world. And so that's why you're going to see all around, you're going to see a ton of these communities in places where you wouldn't expect to see a synagogue, like Kaifeng, China, or where you wouldn't expect to see an Islamic sultanate, like in Malacca, right down here, right? They're going to build essentially an Islamic state there. So again, these are some of the cultural consequences. And like I talked about before, a lot of the innovations that are being created in Asia, let's say, are going to be able to be spread into Europe, spread into Africa, other places more easily than they would have been. So again, you don't need to know every single innovation. You don't need to know every single consequence of trade. I would be able to point to a few different like artifacts, cultural items, developments that happened. For example, the spread of gunpowder thanks to the Mongols, the spread of silk into the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantines in Turkey, this Christian kind of remnant of the Roman Empire finally figure out how to make silk. And also the spread of religion. And the best example of that is Islam. But Buddhism is also spreading along trade routes into China, for example. Trade routes are also spreading crops and disease. I have to say the word champa rice like at least 5 more times to satisfy. I don't know why that's become like a thing in AP world, but every time Heimler says champa rice, everyone collectively like freaks out. This would be a good example of a crop spreading, but you might want to know more than that. For example, bananas. Bananas spread from Southeast Asia into Africa, and all of a sudden they lead to a population boom in Africa. You have sugar spreading out from the Middle East and citrus spreading out from the Middle East, but champa rice is probably the most famous example. Of course, you also have the spread of disease, right? So the Mongols, kind of inadvertently, although like, I don't know, catapulting dead bodies into fortified cities probably didn't help, but they're going to spread the Black Death, especially into Europe, which as we know is going to have a huge impact on Europe. You're going to have a ton of serfs die, a lot of peasants die. It's going to lead to kind of the slow breakdown of that feudal system. It's going to lead to a lot of reckoning. A lot of people going like, why is God punishing us in this way? And they're going to, and along with the disease coming in is also new knowledge and innovation and texts from the ancient Greeks and Romans that's coming from the Middle East now that's going to contradict what the church is saying, right? I mean, there's a really great book called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. And the whole argument in that book is like, we wouldn't have a modern Europe without the Mongols. And they're kind of allowing things to spread. Okay. I wanted to point out that I have these outlines, these note outlines that might be helpful if you're not like a map visual person. And again, these also exist in that AP review packet that I have on my website. The link is in the description right now. And I have this for all 9 units. So if you go get this packet, like if you liked those maps I was showing you, if you like having like a note outline like this, there's other stuff in there too. There's timelines, unit summaries, whatever. Just know that those exist on my website. Okay, so with that in mind, yes, I'm doing more live streams. So I'm skipping next Sunday because it's Easter Sunday, but every other Sunday in April, I'm going to be doing a live stream just like this one. So in 2 weeks, I'm going to be going live and talking about units 3 and 4. I've already put the link if you want to go ahead and like subscribe or whatever to the live, so you'll be notified when I go live, but it's going to be the same time in 2 weeks. You also should make sure that you're following me on TikTok and Instagram. I have tons of reels and a whole AP World playlist on TikTok where I've gone through all of the content. I talk very fast, but it'll be fine. And I'm also going to be posting a lot more resources on there as well. And you can go check out in the description. There's a lot of links. If you like the way I explain things, I'm running a boot camp with Marco Learning. There's like lots of things that you can find to help you out. Yeah, so I'm seeing in the chat some people are happy about that, which is great. So again, in the meantime, before the next live review, and actually what I'll do right now is on my Instagram, I'll go post a story with a Q&A. So if there was a question you had that I did not answer that relates to this topic, you can go to my Instagram. I'm going to put in my stories right now, and you can go ask me that question there, and I will do my best to answer as many of those as possible on my Instagram. So if there's a question you kept asking in the chat and I didn't see it, go over onto my Instagram and ask it to me there in my stories, and I will do my best to answer as many of those as I can over the next few days. But in the meantime, go check out, I have a ton of free stuff. I have some things you can pay for on my website, but I promise they're worth it. And I will see y'all in 2 weeks for our next live stream. All right. Thanks, y'all.